January 30th, 1945. Cabanatuan, POW camp, Luzon, Philippines. The morning mist clung to the barbed wire like a shroud, a thin, ghostly veil across the sun-scorched earth. Corporal James "Jimmy" Donovan, 24, U.S. Army Air Forces, lay on the bare wooden slats of his bunk, every bone aching, his uniform nothing more than a threadbare jacket and tattered trousers. Outside, the faint clang of a guard's boots on the concrete echoed through the camp. Somewhere behind the gate, chickens pecked at scraps. Dogs barked, and the sickly, acrid smell of human misery, the stench of malnutrition, disease, and months of suffering, hung thick in the air. Donovan's stomach rumbled. Again, hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing and unrelenting. A few scraps of rice, a bit of water, and occasionally a piece of raw vegetable stolen from the Japanese kitchen were all that had kept him alive. Many others hadn't been so fortunate. He knew the names. Faces he couldn't forget. Private Miller, Sergeant Hayes, Lieutenant Anders. All gone, claimed by dysentery, beriberi, or the merciless beatings that came without warning. He rolled onto his side, wincing at the soreness in his ribs from the wooden planks. The camp was quiet now, the pre-dawn calm that always seemed heavier than the day's heat. The thin beams of sunlight creeping through the slats in the wooden barracks fell across his hollowed cheekbones. Donovan swallowed, feeling the dryness in his throat, the weakness in his limbs. He wondered if today would be like all the others. Another day to survive, another day to endure, another day to watch the human spirit strain to the limit. A sudden shout rang out, cutting through the fog. Japanese guards were moving faster than usual. Donovan's head lifted slowly. The clatter of boots, the barking of orders in clipped Japanese syllables, the distant rumble of engines. Something felt different. Corporal Franklin Reyes, a burly man with a permanent limp from an earlier beating, poked his head through the doorway. "Jimmy, do you hear that?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the tension in it made Donovan's chest tighten. "I hear engines," Donovan replied, uncertain. They weren't supposed to have vehicles here. Not in the middle of the camp. Supply trucks? Reyes shook his head. "No, not trucks. Tanks." His eyes widened, scanning the horizon through the misted wire fence. And then the first sound came clearly. A low, deep rumble, unmistakable and terrifying. The growl of armored vehicles. The Japanese guards paused, exchanging brief, terse orders. For the first time in months, Donovan's ears caught something impossible. Voices in English, shouting commands, laughter, cheers even faintly, carried across the fields. He pushed himself upright, the muscles in his arms trembling from disuse. Heart hammering, he peered through the slats in the barracks. A dozen feet from the gate, M4 Sherman tanks emerged through the morning fog, their turrets swiveling. Behind them, soldiers in olive drab uniforms sprinted forward, rifles at the ready, smoke and dust rising from the disturbed earth. The POWs pressed themselves against the walls of the barracks, squinting, trying to make sense of the scene. "You're kidding," muttered Donovan, disbelief twisting his voice. "God help me, I think we're being freed." Reyes' hand trembled as it gripped the railing. The Japanese guards suddenly shifted, panic overtaking their earlier confidence. A sergeant barked orders, but his words were drowned out by the roar of American voices and gunfire as the liberating force swept through the outer perimeter. Donovan could see the fear in the faces of the guards, their rigid postures collapsing into chaotic flight. From inside the barracks, the men exchanged glances, eyes wide, some in silent disbelief, some crying silently. Months, years of suffering, all of it hanging on this fragile, impossible moment. The voice called out from the open gate, crisp and commanding. "All right, men. Weapons down. You're safe now." Donovan froze. His mind could barely register the words. Safe? After all this? The word felt alien, almost meaningless. He wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but no sound emerged. Instead, he let his knees buckle as relief and exhaustion coursed through his body. Outside, the American soldiers moved methodically, securing the camp, checking on every barracks, every prisoner. Some of the POWs stumbled toward them, their legs weak, their faces hollow. Others remained on the wooden slats, staring, waiting to confirm this was real. Donovan finally found his voice, raw and cracking. "We're alive," he whispered. "Yes, Corporal." "Alive," Reyes echoed, disbelief lacing every syllable. Beyond the walls of Cabanatuan, the sun had risen fully, cutting through the fog. Dust hung in the air, swirling around the tanks and soldiers, glinting off the barrels of rifles. The camp itself, once a place of despair, looked almost ordinary in the light. Wooden barracks, fences, and gates, but Donovan knew better. He had seen its dark underbelly. He had known its cruelty, its hunger, its death. And yet now, in this surreal, blindingly bright morning, the impossible had happened. He had survived. Somewhere behind him, a POW vomited from weakness. Another collapsed, tears streaking his dust-covered face. Donovan knelt beside him, offering a shaky hand. Around the camp, the sounds of liberation, the crackle of rifles, shouted orders, the distant rumble of tanks, filled the air, but he took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp tang of smoke and morning air. It was still war. The Pacific still burned. But in this small corner of Luzon, in this moment, the war had ended for them. For him, he sat back on the rough wooden slats, staring at the open gate, the tanks rolling slowly forward, soldiers moving with purpose, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope. The sun climbed higher, turning the morning haze into a shimmering, almost unreal heat that danced over the barbed wire and mud-streaked barracks. Corporal James Donovan staggered toward the open yard, his legs weak from months of barely moving, and his uniform hanging loosely from his frame. Around him, men were emerging like ghosts, some walking, some crawling, some too exhausted to do more than lean against each other for support. Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Anders appeared from the shadows of a nearby barrack, his gaunt face lined with starvation and disease. He blinked rapidly at the sight of the American soldiers moving among the prisoners, rifles slung, bayonets clipped to the side. Anders stopped dead, confusion and relief warping his features. "Is this real?" he whispered to Donovan. Donovan shook his head slowly, still unable to believe it. I can't." Words failed him. All around them, POWs were encountering their liberators. Some collapsed into arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Others just stood, staring in disbelief. Private Miller, one of Donovan's old tent mates, hugged a young American lieutenant as if he could squeeze himself back into life. Overhead, the roar of Sherman tank engines mingled with the crackle of small arms. Though most POWs didn't notice the fighting, they were consumed by the raw, overwhelming shock of survival that in the distance, a group of Japanese guards had been rounded up and disarmed. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the terror of a defeat they hadn't anticipated. One elderly guard, trembling, dropped a rifle and fell to his knees, bowing repeatedly, a gesture Donovan barely understood. It was almost surreal, enemy and liberator sharing the same yard, but the balance of fear had shifted completely. Medical personnel moved quickly among the prisoners, assessing injuries, distributing water, and wrapping thin blankets around trembling shoulders. The effects of prolonged starvation were visible everywhere. Sunken eyes, bloated stomachs, scabs from untreated wounds. Donovan watched as a medic knelt beside a young corporal, holding a bowl of thin rice gruel to his lips. He tried to swallow, coughing, but the medic persisted. It was a small act of care, a lifeline, and Donovan felt a pang of both relief and shame for how close they had come to losing so many lives. Some men sat quietly, staring at the sky, as if afraid to take in the reality. Others shouted, laughed, or cried uncontrollably. Donovan noticed one man, a sergeant named Hayes, who had barely survived a brutal forced labor detail. Hayes sank to the ground, face buried in his hands, whispering a single word, alive. He repeated it over and over, as though saying it could somehow make it true. Donovan moved toward the main gate, drawn to the activity there. An officer was directing the unloading of supplies, canned food, medical kits, clean uniforms. Sherman tanks rumbled past, their tracks leaving deep grooves in the dirt. Soldiers from the 6th Ranger Battalion, responsible for the liberation, were checking every barrack, their movements efficient but careful, ensuring no POW was left behind as Donovan approached. A young private offered him a bottle of water. His hand shook as he accepted it, the cold liquid sliding down his throat, quenching a thirst he didn't even realize he still felt. Around him, the camp seemed to exhale, a collective release of tension built up over months of fear and hopelessness. Donovan's mind drifted to the long, harrowing months inside Cabanatuan. The forced marches, the starvation, the beatings, the loss of friends to disease and exhaustion. He thought of the long nights spent whispering encouragement to those too weak to eat, of the silent prayers he muttered when no one else was listening. Every small act of endurance had led them to this moment. Every ration of rice hoarded, every scrap of hope preserved. It all culminated here, in the bright chaos of freedom. Through the gate, a young American lieutenant knelt to help a frail POW step down from the wooden platform. Donovan followed, walking among the men, watching their reactions. He realized that survival was not just about enduring. It was about witnessing, remembering, and holding on to humanity in the face of relentless cruelty. The camp was still technically under military control, but the prisoners were now masters of their own destiny. Donovan felt a mix of emotions: relief, disbelief, gratitude, and a profound, almost overwhelming joy that life had, against all odds, persisted in that moment as he looked at his fellow soldiers. Many unrecognizable, others miraculously whole. Donovan understood the depth of human endurance. They had been broken, bent, and beaten down by months of suffering, yet here they stood alive, and somehow impossibly free. The sun had climbed higher over Cabanatuan, turning the once oppressive shadows of the camp into harsh, glaring light. Corporal James Donovan's feet crunched over the gravel as he followed the other POWs toward the open fields beyond the barbed wire. Each step felt strange, alien, muscles unused to bearing weight in weeks of near immobility protested. Yet the freedom in every stride was palpable, tangible, almost overwhelming. Lieutenant Robert Anders walked beside him, shoulders hunched as if the very act of standing upright were dangerous. He glanced over at Donovan, eyes wide, voice hoarse. "I can't believe it. After everything, we're walking out of here." Donovan nodded, swallowing hard. "We are. Somehow we are." He tried to match his pace to Anders, who was surprisingly steady given his gaunt frame. Around them, men stumbled, some needing assistance, others leaning heavily on friends for support. Yet all were moving forward. The liberated prisoners' collective movement felt almost ceremonial, an exodus from hell into a world that had continued without them. The American soldiers of the 6th Ranger Battalion moved among them, guiding, encouraging, and checking the prisoners' condition. Sergeant John Logan, a stocky man with a shaved head and eyes that had seen too much combat, knelt beside a frail private. "You okay, son? Can you keep walking?" The private nodded weakly, clutching Logan's arm. "I think so. I think I can." Donovan's eyes swept the landscape. Beyond the camp, the fields of Luzon stretched wide and green, interrupted by clusters of small nipa huts and distant palm trees swaying gently in the tropical breeze. The contrast between the natural beauty and the horrors of the camp struck him sharply. Here was life, sunlight, wind, open air, while months ago, mere survival had been a struggle against filth, hunger, and despair. As they approached the edge of the camp, Donovan noticed a shallow trench running parallel to the perimeter fence, long forgotten and half filled with rainwater. A group of men carefully navigated around it, some pausing to aid weaker comrades. A medic moved quickly, kneeling beside a young corporal who had collapsed from exhaustion. The medic's hands were steady, his touch gentle, his presence a quiet reassurance that the nightmare was over, at least for now. The Sherman tanks rumbled behind them, a reassuring presence, their steel hulks a symbol of overwhelming force that had ensured the prisoners' liberation. Donovan could hear the hum of engines, the clank of tracks over gravel, and the occasional shout from a tank commander directing his crew. Even in the midst of relief, the reality of war lingered in every sound. Suddenly, a group of POWs broke into laughter, their joy unrestrained and raw. Some spun in circles, arms raised to the sky, tears streaking their dust-covered faces. Donovan felt a lump in his throat. After months of hunger and brutality, after witnessing friends die, after enduring every imaginable indignity, this joy was almost unbearable in its intensity. A young private named Eddie Thompson tripped over a small rock, falling flat on his face. Before he could rise, Donovan and Anders were there, helping him to his feet. Thompson laughed weakly, wiping mud from his cheek. Feels weird to be alive, he murmured. Yes, Donovan said softly. It does. The POWs began to gather near a makeshift staging area, where medics had set up tents for initial triage and nourishment. Thin rice porridge, canned beans, and clean water were offered, and for the first time in months, Donovan felt the bitter, sweet satisfaction of real food. Some men ate ravenously, shoveling spoonfuls into mouths so dry they could barely swallow. Others picked at their portions cautiously, afraid to believe the meal was genuine. Meanwhile, American soldiers checked the camp meticulously, ensuring no POW had been overlooked. They also documented evidence of abuse, photographing dilapidated barracks, malnourished prisoners, and emaciated survivors. Donovan watched them, realizing that this documentation would serve as proof, not just of survival, but of endurance in the face of unimaginable cruelty. A low hum of aircraft passed overhead, the distant thrum of engines signaling air support in the broader Luzon campaign. Donovan looked up, letting the sun warm his face, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not fleeting, not fragile, but real. The world was moving forward, and he, against all odds, was part of it. He glanced around at the faces of his fellow prisoners, some friends, some strangers who had shared the same suffering. Each of them carried the same stunned expression, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and exhaustion. The liberation was not a single moment. It was a process, one step at a time, each step bringing them closer to safety, closer to life. Donovan's thoughts turned briefly to those who hadn't survived. The empty bunks, the silent barracks, the names whispered in memory. They were with him in every step he took, in every breath he drew. The liberation was theirs too, in spirit, if not in presence. As the POWs continued their cautious journey away from the camp, Donovan realized that survival had changed him, reshaped him. The simplest things, a warm breeze, sunlight on skin, the sound of laughter, held new meaning. Each moment of normality was a miracle, a victory over the months of suffering he and his comrades had endured. For the first time in a long time, Donovan allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the fences, beyond the abuse, beyond the endless uncertainty. Freedom was not just a physical state, it was a revelation, and it had arrived, in the form of American soldiers, Sherman tanks, and a morning that felt impossibly bright after the darkness of captivity. Corporal James Donovan turned his gaze toward the American soldiers moving among them, faces he would never forget. Sergeant John Logan, the stocky, no-nonsense NCO, barked quiet orders, ensuring that no one stumbled or wandered too far. His eyes, sharp and watchful, scanned the prisoners as if measuring not just their physical state, but the fragile thread of their spirits. Donovan realized that the liberators were not just delivering safety. They were carrying hope, discipline, and reassurance into a world where those things had been nearly extinguished. A young lieutenant knelt beside a particularly frail POW, a boy barely 19, brushing the dirt from his uniform and checking the man's weak pulse. Donovan noted the care in his movements, the gentleness that contrasted sharply with the harshness of their past months. Here were soldiers trained for war, yet aware that the battle they had just entered was not against an enemy in uniforms, but against hunger, disease, and despair. Donovan walked slowly toward another part of the camp, noticing two rangers lifting the limp body of an emaciated prisoner into a stretcher. The man groaned faintly, eyes half closed but alive. Around him, the camp had become a flurry of organized chaos. Medics, soldiers, and POWs working together in a rhythm dictated not by combat, but by life itself. "Stay close," Logan shouted to the group of prisoners moving nearby. "We've got medics and food ahead." Donovan glanced up at the towering Sherman tanks, now lined along the main road of the camp. The hulks of steel seemed almost like sentinels, guardians who had delivered the men from captivity. Their engines rumbled softly, a comforting counterpoint to the cries, coughs, and whispered conversations around the yard. One tank commander waved to a group of POWs, and Donovan felt a lump form in his throat, an acknowledgement of shared humanity in the midst of war. Nearby, a small squad of rangers was clearing debris from the outer fence, prying open rusted gates, and ensuring that no trap or overlooked weapon threatened the newly liberated men. Their uniforms were dusty, sleeves rolled up, but their eyes were clear, focused, and resolute. Donovan watched one of the soldiers, a young private named Thomas Green, bend down to offer a hand to a trembling former prisoner, helping him navigate the uneven ground. The simplest gestures carried weight, proof that someone cared, proof that the nightmare had ended. In the corner of the camp, Donovan noticed Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, the commander of the liberating force, moving between groups of POWs, speaking quietly, encouragingly, yet with unmistakable authority. Every man he passed seemed to draw strength from his presence. Donovan followed Mucci's path with his eyes, absorbing the scene. The precise coordination, the urgency without panic, the humanity tempered with efficiency. These men had come to liberate, and they were doing it flawlessly. The camp itself seemed to breathe in tandem with the new arrivals. Smoke from small cooking fires curled upward, mingling with the mist of morning sweat and dust. The wooden barracks, scarred and weathered, held silent testimony to months of suffering. Donovan could almost hear the echoes of the past, the whispered prayers at night, the groans of the sick, the soft footfalls of those too weak to rise. And now, the same structures were alive with movement, with the reclamation of life. Nearby, a young medic called out instructions. "Get him on the stretcher. We've got fluids and blankets ready." A former prisoner, barely recognizable under a layer of grime and fatigue, was carefully lifted and carried toward a triage tent. Donovan noted the meticulous care with which every action was executed. The liberators understood that survival required more than just physical extraction. It required attention, patience, and compassion. Donovan paused, letting the scene wash over him. Around him, men who had been prisoners just minutes ago were now walking, eating, and talking. Some laughed, some wept, some stared blankly, overwhelmed by disbelief. The American soldiers moved like shadows of reassurance among them, making sure that every man knew he was safe, that every life mattered. He spotted a ranger kneeling beside an older POW, offering water and a gentle hand on his shoulder. Donovan walked closer, catching the man's murmured words. "I thought I'd never see this day, never see anyone care." The ranger smiled faintly, eyes reflecting understanding. "You made it," he said simply. "You're alive. That's all that matters now." Donovan felt a wave of gratitude, relief, and humility. Survival had brought him here, but it was the courage, skill, and humanity of these liberators that ensured his continued life. Each of them, in their discipline and care, embodied the promise of freedom he had nearly lost hope of ever seeing. The camp, once a place of despair, was now alive with purpose, with movement, with life itself. Donovan realized that this day, this liberation, was not just a victory over their captors. It was a victory of the human spirit, a testament to endurance, courage, and the unyielding will to survive. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the lingering mist, Donovan took a deep breath, letting the reality sink in. He was free. They were all free. And for the first time in months, the world felt like it belonged to them again. By mid-morning, the liberated POWs of Cabanatuan had begun to gather around makeshift tables where food and water were being distributed. The smells, rich, unfamiliar, and almost overwhelming, hit Donovan's senses like a shock. He had not smelled cooked meat in months, not tasted bread or sugar, not felt the warmth of a proper meal settle in his stomach. His hands trembled as he reached for a tin of beans and a piece of hard bread. Private Eddie Thompson, who had stumbled during the morning's walk, was beside him, picking at the food cautiously. It's real," he whispered, staring at the tin as if it were a miracle. Donovan nodded, swallowing hard, the first taste of nourishment in weeks. The warm beans slid down his throat, and for the first time in months, his body felt a flicker of strength returning. Around him, the sounds of eating, sighs, and whispered conversations filled the camp, mingling with distant shouts from the liberating soldiers coordinating logistics. Medics moved among the men, checking for signs of malnutrition, dehydration, and disease. A young corporal, shivering from a combination of weakness and cold, was wrapped in a fresh blanket by a nurse. Donovan watched, realizing that this care, simple, patient, attentive, was something he had long forgotten existed. A ranger approached Donovan and handed him a bottle of water, nodding briefly. "Drink slowly, Corporal. Take it easy." Donovan nodded, holding the bottle as if it were a precious artifact, small sips letting the water flow down his parched throat. Nearby, Sergeant John Logan guided a group of frail men to a long line of soldiers carrying crates of dried fruit and canned milk. Faces lit with hope, some men whispered prayers, others laughed weakly, disbelief etched into every line of their worn faces. Donovan glanced at Anders, who was carefully rationing his portion, almost afraid to believe it was real as the men ate. Donovan's thoughts drifted to those who hadn't made it. Empty bunks haunted his vision, ghostly reminders of lives lost to hunger, disease, and brutality. He thought of Private Miller, Lieutenant Anders, and Sergeant Hayes, their faces still vivid in his memory. Every bite he took felt like a small defiance, a way of honoring their sacrifice, a step back from the edge of despair they had shared. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of fog. Across the camp, Sherman tanks rumbled as soldiers continued to secure the perimeter, ensuring no threat remained. The contrast between the gentle care inside the camp and the mechanical precision outside was stark but reassuring. Liberation was both chaos and order, a delicate balance between relief and vigilance. Donovan noticed a small group of POWs gathered around a makeshift table, sharing scraps of food among themselves. They laughed quietly, tentative but genuine, a sound Donovan had not heard in months. He approached, offering his own portion to a younger private who looked too weak to eat. "Here," he said softly. "Take it. We'll eat together." The boy nodded, eyes bright, fingers trembling as he accepted the food. Donovan felt a warmth spreading through him, a reminder that survival was not just physical, but emotional. It was shared, communal, and human. Beyond the camp, the rumble of vehicles and distant gunfire reminded everyone that the war was not over. Luzon was still a battlefield. Yet inside the gates of Cabanatuan, the liberation had created a sanctuary, a place where men could reclaim pieces of themselves stolen by months of captivity. Donovan's gaze swept the camp. Men sat in clusters, some laughing, some weeping, some simply staring at the sky. He realized that survival was no longer about enduring pain in silence, but about living, even tentatively, in the light of freedom. Each small bite, each sip of water, each gentle touch from a medic or a fellow prisoner was a step toward reclaiming life. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm his face. The taste of food, the feel of warmth, the sounds of laughter. It was overwhelming, almost too much to bear after the long months of deprivation. Yet in that overwhelming flood of sensation, Donovan felt something he had thought impossible. Joy. Pure, fragile, human joy. Somewhere, a POW muttered a quiet prayer of thanks. Another whispered a name of a lost friend. Donovan joined them silently, letting gratitude and relief wash over him. They had survived against all odds. And in that moment, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he believed that life, in all its small, extraordinary details, could begin anew. By early afternoon, the liberated POWs began to confront another reality, the world beyond Cabanatuan. Soldiers of the 6th Ranger Battalion moved through the camp, distributing paper, pens, and envelopes. Small desks and tables had been set up in a corner near the main gate for writing letters to family. For many, it was the first connection to home in months, some for over a year. Corporal James Donovan approached a worn wooden table, taking a seat beside Lieutenant Anders and a few other men. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the thin sheet of paper. The sun, harsh and warm over the camp, glinted off the metal of the nearby tanks and rifles, casting sharp shadows over the POWs' exhausted faces. Around him, whispers of hope mingled with soft cries, the weight of months of silence breaking in a single, chaotic wave. He dipped the pen into a small ink bottle, his mind racing. What would he write? How could he convey that he was alive after enduring hell? He glanced at Anders, who was already scribbling furiously, tears streaking his grime-streaked face. "Mom, Dad, I'm alive," Donovan began, unsure if the words felt real even as he wrote them. His mind flashed back to the marches, the forced labor, the beatings, and the endless hunger. Each memory threatened to overwhelm him, but now it was tempered by the sunlight, by the warmth of the food, by the gentle encouragement of the liberators moving quietly among them. Beside him, a medic paused to offer water. Donovan took a small sip, nodded in thanks, and returned to the letter. The words came slowly at first, halting, but then with increasing confidence. Words of survival, of thanks, of hope. He wanted his family to know he had endured, that he had seen the worst of human cruelty and had come out the other side. Around the camp, other POWs wrote as well. Some wept quietly into the paper. Others laughed softly, disbelief etched into every line of their faces. A young private named Eddie Thompson wrote a single word repeatedly, "alive," over and over. Donovan smiled faintly at that simplicity. Sometimes survival needed no embellishment. From the gate, the distant rumble of vehicles reminded the men that liberation was only the beginning. The war still raged in Luzon, and safety here was temporary. Yet the act of writing, the simple act of reaching out to someone who might have feared them lost forever, was transformative. It restored humanity, a tether to the life they had left behind, and a bridge to the life they hoped to reclaim. A ranger approached Donovan, leaning slightly over his shoulder. "Wanting to take that to the nearest post?" he asked, voice careful. Donovan nodded, feeling a strange sense of gratitude. For the first time in months, he was being cared for, not just physically, but in every small, meaningful way. Across the camp, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci moved among the men, observing quietly, ensuring that order and care were balanced. His presence was commanding yet comforting, a reassurance that the liberation was real and lasting. Soldiers in olive drab uniforms guided the men toward medical tents, showers, and clean clothes. Every small gesture underscored a simple truth. The men were no longer prisoners. They were human again. Donovan finished his letter, carefully folding the paper and tucking it into the provided envelope. For a moment, he simply sat, staring at the sunlit horizon beyond the barbed wire, imagining the faces of his family receiving his words. Relief, disbelief, and a fragile hope mingled inside him. After months of fear, starvation, and cruelty, he had survived. He was alive, and he could tell someone that he had made it through. He glanced around at his fellow POWs, each absorbed in their own writing, their own moments of reconnection. Some wrote frantically, afraid the moment might slip away. Others lingered, hesitant, overwhelmed by emotion. Donovan realized that liberation was not just the act of being freed. It was the first step in reclaiming a life stolen for too long. Outside the camp, the sun climbed higher, glinting off the distant hills, the rooftops of nearby villages, and the green expanse of the Luzon plains. The day felt impossibly long, yet impossibly new. The world beyond Cabanatuan waited, and Donovan, for the first time in months, felt that he could meet it. He folded his hands over the table, letting the warmth of the sun wash over his bruised body. The letters were more than ink on paper. They were symbols of survival, proof that life persisted, proof that human endurance could triumph even in the darkest of places. And as he watched fellow prisoners rise, step forward, and reconnect with a world that had seemed impossibly distant, Donovan allowed himself a quiet, tremulous thought. Perhaps he could not just survive, but live. Truly live. As the afternoon heat settled over Cabanatuan, the POWs began tentatively to reclaim more than just their freedom. They began reclaiming the smallest fragments of their stolen humanity. Corporal James Donovan walked slowly through the camp, observing the subtle yet profound transformations unfolding around him. Men who had spent months as shadows of themselves were now engaging with the world, their movements awkward at first, hesitant but real. In one corner, a group of men carefully washed their faces at a makeshift trough, water glistening over cracked skin and sunken eyes. A former sergeant named Miller laughed softly, the sound startlingly bright in the otherwise somber camp, as he splashed a younger private who had forgotten how to smile. Donovan felt a strange swell in his chest, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in months. The world had returned some of its color, even if only temporarily, to a landscape that had been defined by gray misery. Nearby, medics led a procession of prisoners to the tents for medical examination. Donovan watched as one frail private received treatment for swollen legs from malnutrition and long periods of immobility. The medic's hands moved with careful precision, the attention to detail almost reverential. This was not just medicine, it was an affirmation of life. Each small intervention, each bandage, each sip of water was a reclaiming of dignity that the captors had stripped away. Donovan approached Lieutenant Anders, who was helping a fellow POW tie a clean shirt around his waist. Anders looked at Donovan with a mix of fatigue and wonder. "I can't believe it," he said softly. "After everything, they brought us back like we matter." Donovan nodded. "We do matter. And right now, we get to remember that." Beyond the immediate care, the liberators encouraged the POWs to begin small acts of normalcy, straightening bunks, clearing debris, and even tending to small patches of the camp's overgrown garden. The gestures were symbolic, almost ceremonial, reclaiming ownership over their own space, reminding themselves that their lives were no longer subject to the whims of brutality. Donovan stopped near a tree where a young private was reading a tattered Bible he had salvaged from the barracks. The man's lips moved silently, whispering prayers, his eyes bright with newfound hope. Nearby, Thompson and a few others played a quiet game of cards, tentative laughter punctuating the air. These small moments, Donovan realized, were as vital as the food and medical care. They were signs that the human spirit could endure, adapt, and begin to heal even after months of deprivation. As the sun began its slow descent, shadows stretched across the camp, and Donovan noticed something he had long forgotten: a sense of community. Former prisoners huddled in groups, sharing stories, helping one another walk, laugh, eat, or simply breathe. Bonds forged in suffering now became lifelines in liberation. Donovan himself found a few moments to sit with Thompson and Anders, sharing a small ration of bread. No one spoke at first. The silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that words were insufficient for what they had endured. A young medic approached Donovan with a message from Lieutenant Colonel Mucci. "Sir, we're organizing a transport for the able-bodied men to reach friendly lines. Others will stay under our protection until fully stabilized." Donovan nodded, realizing that the journey of survival extended beyond the gates of Cabanatuan. Liberation was not the end. It was a bridge to recovery, to reintegration, to reclaiming a life that had been put on hold. Donovan's gaze shifted to the surrounding landscape. The green hills, distant villages, the winding roads leading out of the camp. It seemed impossibly vast, almost overwhelming compared to the claustrophobic misery of the barracks and fenced enclosures. And yet, each step forward was a choice, a declaration, a reclamation of agency that had been denied for far too long. He breathed deeply, the tropical air rich with the scent of earth and foliage. He realized that survival was only the first act. Now came the slower, quieter, and perhaps more profound task: healing, rebuilding, and remembering what it meant to be human. As dusk approached, Donovan allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. Around him, laughter, conversation, and the gentle bustle of care filled the camp. For the first time in months, he could imagine a future beyond the pain, beyond the hunger, beyond the fear. And in that imagining, he found a fragile, unshakable truth. He had survived. Not merely endured, but survived. And he would carry that survival forward, step by step, day by day, into a life that against all odds still awaited him. By evening, the preparations for departure had begun. Corporal James Donovan and the other liberated POWs were escorted to waiting trucks and jeeps, lined up under the fading glow of the Philippine sunset. The air was thick with dust, smoke from distant fires, and a lingering smell of the camp. But for the first time, each inhale carried freedom, not fear. Donovan climbed into a military truck, his muscles stiff from months of immobility, and sat beside Lieutenant Anders. Both men stared silently at the receding silhouette of Cabanatuan, its wooden barracks and barbed wire fading into the distance. Sergeant John Logan, seated at the front beside the driver, barked quiet orders to ensure order, but his eyes softened as he glanced back at the survivors. "Keep your hands inside. We've got you," he said, his tone firm but reassuring. The men nodded, a mixture of relief and fatigue written plainly on their faces. The truck rumbled forward, carrying them toward medical stations and eventually to the larger Allied lines. The road was bumpy, filled with deep ruts carved by months of monsoon rains. Dust rose in thick clouds, coating faces and uniforms, but it went unnoticed. Donovan's mind wandered, recalling the months of captivity, the forced labor, the starvation, the beatings, the long, restless nights. And yet now, in the dim light of the evening, he realized that those months had not broken him. They had tested him, pushed him to the edge, but he had survived. He had endured that a fellow POW, Private Thompson, shifted beside him, still weak, his eyes half closed. "I can't believe it," he murmured. "We're really going home?" Donovan placed a steadying hand on Thompson's shoulder. "Yes, we're going home. Finally." The convoy moved past fields scarred by war, remnants of destroyed villages, and distant columns of smoke. Yet Donovan noticed the signs of life returning. Children running through open fields, farmers tending to small patches of land, and soldiers patrolling with calm efficiency. The world outside the camp had moved forward without them, but now they were returning, rejoining the living, reclaiming their place in a temporary Allied medical station. The men were unloaded. Stretchers carried the weakest, while others were guided to tents for examination and treatment. Medics worked tirelessly, checking vital signs, administering fluids, and preparing the men for the next leg of their journey. Donovan received a clean set of clothes, a warm blanket, and a small ration of food. Each item was simple, yet for a man who had endured months of deprivation, it felt monumental, a tangible sign of life, of care, of restoration. As night fell, the survivors gathered around small fires, talking quietly, some in disbelief, some laughing softly. Donovan sat beside Anders, sharing stories of small triumphs and memories from before capture. Each tale was a reminder that life had existed beyond the fences and barbed wire, that hope had not been extinguished. Overhead, stars dotted the tropical sky, indifferent to the human suffering and endurance below. Yet for Donovan, each point of light was a reminder of survival, a silent witness to the resilience of men who had faced unimaginable cruelty and emerged alive. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of months lift just slightly, replaced by a cautious optimism. The journey home would be long. There would be recovery, reintegration, and the slow work of healing both body and mind. But for now, Donovan allowed himself a rare, unguarded sense of peace. He was free. He was alive. And the world, in all its vastness and uncertainty, was once again his to navigate. In the quiet hum of the medical station and the soft murmur of survivors sharing whispered words and memories, Donovan realized that survival was not merely an act of endurance. It was a reclamation of the self, a reaffirmation of humanity. And in that affirmation, he found the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The following morning, Corporal James Donovan woke in a cot under the canvas roof of the temporary medical tent. The sunlight filtered through the fabric, casting a muted glow over rows of stretched canvas beds, each occupied by a fellow survivor. The quiet hum of medics and the occasional creak of wooden stretchers were the only sounds that punctuated the heavy silence, a fragile calm after the storm of liberation. Donovan sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his limbs, the residual weakness from months of malnutrition. Around him, the other men moved quietly, some washing their faces, some quietly speaking to one another, others simply staring at the thin line of sky visible through the tent flaps. Every face told a story, lines etched by suffering, eyes hollowed by hunger, yet glimmering with a new awareness of survival. Lieutenant Anders appeared beside him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Sleep well?" he asked softly, his voice tentative. Donovan shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "As well as one can after everything." He gestured toward the rows of men. "Look at them. We made it. All of us, the ones still here, anyway." Anders nodded, eyes sweeping the tent. "We did, and we have to remember that. Not just that we survived, but what it took to survive." Outside, the early morning sun was brightening the camp, revealing the scars of neglect and abuse. The weathered wooden barracks, rusted gates, and uneven earth, now softened by dew. Donovan stood and stepped outside, taking in the sight of the camp from a new perspective. American soldiers moved among the survivors, distributing blankets, food, and water, their faces calm but vigilant. Tanks rumbled gently in the background, a reminder that liberation had been hard-won and that the war still continued beyond this moment of reprieve. Donovan's thoughts drifted back to the dark days of captivity, the harsh discipline of Japanese guards, the starvation, the forced labor, the unrelenting fear. And yet here they were, alive, moving with purpose, laughing quietly, helping one another. Survival had been cruel and grueling, but it had forged connections among the men, bonds of resilience and trust that could not be broken. That a medic approached Donovan, handing him a small cup of warm broth. "Drink slowly," she said, her voice gentle. Donovan nodded, sipping carefully. The warmth spread through his body, a quiet, healing comfort after months of cold, hunger, and neglect. Around him, POWs shared stories in hushed tones, recounting memories of home, of family, and of life before the war. Each story, no matter how brief or fractured, was a thread linking them back to the world they had nearly lost. Donovan found himself listening more than speaking, absorbing the narratives, letting the shared experience bind them together. He walked to a small group of men huddled near a makeshift fire, helping one man steady a bowl of food. "Careful," Donovan said, steadying him. The man nodded, eyes grateful, and Donovan felt the first genuine warmth of camaraderie in months. They were not merely survivors. They were a community stitched together by endurance, suffering, and now, liberation. As the sun climbed higher, the men prepared for transport to more secure facilities and eventually to ships and planes that would carry them toward home. Donovan observed the movements, the quiet efficiency of the American soldiers, the careful attention to every detail. He realized that the act of survival had extended beyond mere endurance. It required patience, trust, and the guidance of those who had come to deliver them. He paused near the edge of the camp, looking back at the barbed wire, the wooden barracks, the familiar yet foreign landscape of Cabanatuan. This place had been a tomb, a crucible of suffering, and yet it was also a testament to resilience. The memories of it would never fade, but neither would the proof that survival was possible that endurance could prevail, and that humanity could be reclaimed even in the darkest of places. Donovan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds, smells, and sights settle in. He felt gratitude for the liberators, for his fellow POWs, and for the fragile, unshakable gift of life. He had survived the unthinkable. He had endured captivity, starvation, and fear. And now, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope, not just for survival, but for life beyond the camp, for a future that had seemed impossible just hours ago. By late afternoon, the process of moving the liberated POWs toward Allied lines was underway. Trucks and jeeps, loaded with blankets, food, and medical supplies, lined the muddy paths outside Cabanatuan. Corporal James Donovan and Lieutenant Anders joined the line, helping the weaker men into vehicles. Each step forward was careful, deliberate, as if the act of walking itself required negotiation with bodies starved and broken over months of captivity. Sergeant John Logan barked encouragements, his voice carrying over the hum of engines and the occasional shout from distant patrols. "Keep moving, step by step. You're stronger than you think." His words, rough but sincere, seemed to infuse the men with a mixture of determination and disbelief. Donovan noticed how even the smallest gestures, a hand extended to steady a comrade, a nod of reassurance, a shared sip of water, carried monumental weight. As the trucks rumbled along the uneven paths toward the staging areas, Donovan's eyes swept the landscape. Fields scarred by prior fighting stretched into the distance, dotted with the remnants of destroyed buildings and tanks abandoned in haste. Yet beyond the scars, life was returning. Farmers tended to their crops. Children played cautiously among ruins, and distant villages slowly came back into view. For the first time, Donovan saw the world continuing without pause, a vivid reminder that life moved forward, even when it seemed the darkness would last forever. Inside the truck, men huddled together, sharing blankets and small portions of food. Thompson rested his head on Donovan's shoulder, his eyes heavy but awake, absorbing every sound and movement. Donovan placed a steadying hand on the younger man, feeling a shared heartbeat of endurance, a silent acknowledgement of the horrors they had survived and the fragile hope of life ahead. To the next stop, a medical tent awaited those in need of immediate care. Medics moved with precise urgency, assessing vital signs, administering fluids, and stabilizing the weak. Donovan assisted where he could, helping a frail corporal to a cot, offering reassurance with quiet words. The weight of months in captivity had not only broken bodies, but had stretched the limits of trust. Yet here, under the attentive hands of the liberators, humanity was being restored in measured, deliberate doses. Outside, Sherman tanks rumbled in steady patrols, their engines a comforting cadence to the survivors. Donovan watched one commander lean out of the turret, offering a nod and a small smile to the men moving past. That simple gesture carried the reassurance of protection, a confirmation that the liberation was not temporary, that safety, however fragile, was now tangible. As dusk fell, casting long shadows over the recovering camp, the men began to speak more openly. Conversations that had been impossible in the confines of captivity now flowed freely, laughter and whispered anecdotes punctuating the air. Donovan listened as a few men recounted memories of home, of families waiting, and of dreams postponed but not extinguished. Each story was a small reclamation of identity, a rebuilding of self that captivity had tried to erase. Lieutenant Anders turned to Donovan, voice quiet but firm. "We made it, all of us, and we get to carry this forward. We get to live." Donovan nodded, feeling a wave of emotion he could neither suppress nor name. Relief, gratitude, disbelief, and a cautious hope surged together, settling like a fragile dawn inside him in the fading light. Donovan allowed himself a long, deep breath. He had survived unimaginable suffering, endured months of starvation and fear, and now stood on the threshold of life reclaimed. The journey ahead would be difficult. Healing bodies, reconciling minds, returning to a world that had moved without them. But for the first time, he believed in the possibility of a future not defined by captivity, but by freedom, endurance, and the simple, extraordinary act of living. Around him, the camp was alive with movement, voices, and the quiet triumph of survival. Donovan took in the sight, the rescued, the liberators, the landscape stretching beyond, and felt the profound, unshakable truth of the day. He had survived. They had survived, and the long, arduous march from hell to freedom had only just begun.